Welcome to the fifth Industrial Revolution. My name is Rachin Kansal. I'm a professor at Seton Hall University, and I am the director of the course, The Fifth Industrial Revolution. It is a narrative project exploring the intersection of human existence, technology, and biology. I see from where I sit two major trend lines. One, a trend line that's focused on driving sustainability of planet Earth, from climate perspective, food perspective, energy perspective, everything that you can think of. And it is a train that has left the station, and really a lot of focus happening from regulation to business to economic perspective. The other trend line is the race for space. The cost of innovation or the cost of sending a kilo into space has gone down from $56,000 30 years ago to $2,500 today, and rapidly decreasing. So we are getting to a point where going to space at scale and innovation in space at scale is going to become a much real reality very soon. So that is a big industry we are looking at. The barrier to both of those, or an enabler to both of those, can be health technology, because right now human bodies as we know them are not going to be adept at surviving either high wet temperatures on planet Earth or life on moon. But health technology can potentially enable it. So will health technology unleash the next industrial revolution and create the next socioeconomic structure for human race? That is the question we are asking. Anthony Tillman, two of my students, are helping me with that. And we have the privilege of some really great speakers on the topic who are sharing their perspectives from their fields of study. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Will Ratcliff from Georgia Tech. Dr. Ratcliff is a PhD in ecology, evolution, and human behavior, or behavior, not human behavior. He's also the winner of Popular Science Brilliant 10 Award, the NSF Career Award, and the Packard Fellowship. We are really happy to have you here today with us, Dr. Ratcliff. Why don't you introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, thanks. It's great to be here. So I'm an associate professor of biological sciences, and I'm also the co-director of our interdisciplinary graduate program in quantitative biosciences. And so our lab primarily does research on the origin of complex life, and specifically the evolution of multicellularity, how organisms evolve from being one cell to forming a group, and how those groups of cells subsequently evolve to become more complex. We use a range of techniques. Primarily, we do a technique called experimental evolution or directed evolution, sort of the same thing, where we take, yeast as our main model system, and we, over thousands of generations of evolution in the lab, we watch how they evolve to form simple groups, and those groups evolve to become more complex, with cells becoming increasingly interdependent and functionally specialized. So in addition to doing sort of, yeast cell biology and genetics, we actually, and a fair amount of synthetic biology as well, to be able to make specific constructs and try things out. We also use a lot of mathematical modeling and computational biology as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. And that's very interesting, right? One cell to the group, to the complex organization. So what role has that played in the evolution of human race? I mean, is it the Darwinian theory where we just evolved, or was it this basic biology that has led to human race where we are today?
Yeah, just one second. Let me let my dog out of my room.
Yes, absolutely.
Should have probably thought of that before starting. Okay.
Yeah, so mine is sitting right here by my chair.
I didn't even know she was here. She was just sleeping so quietly. And anyway, so yes, I'll just paint a little bit of a broader picture of sort of the history of life, right? So Earth is 4.5 billion years old.
Yep.
The first life that is we have extremely strong evidence of is essentially cellularized life that's probably sort of already figured out all the hardest bits. And that occurred by 3.5 billion years ago. So within the first billion years of Earth being around, we already had essentially the origin of life. And this is really I think the hardest problems in biology were solved in that first billion years. You have to figure out how to essentially get chemical replicators that have Darwinian properties. That's not super hard, but you have to couple that to metabolism, right? So harnessing energy and using that to drive replication of replicators, that's challenging. There's the origin of a information storage system, DNA to RNA to protein, right? So you had to figure out how to use polymers to store information. There's the origin of a genetic code, sort of a dictionary that takes polymer information and DNA and translates it into functional proteins. There's cellularization, so taking, essentially what would have been probably a very loose, very ecologically different type of life prior to cells, essentially things that are almost more like metabolic components of a network rather than these nice individualized biological entities. Forming cells, cellular wrappers around those things, and that completely changes things, right? Because then information is no longer kind of this mesh, it becomes vertically transmitted. You have largely things now that are essentially independently evolving. And yet there's some horizontal gene transfer, but for the most part, you have this sort of almost event horizon of having life go from being this highly interconnected web to something which is still metabolically really interconnected, but less informationally interconnected once you have lineages that are now capable of evolving independently. All of that had happened in the first billion years of life. And we don't really, we have good ideas for how this may have happened, but it's also the kind of thing that's very, very difficult to directly test because it happened so long ago. There's very little direct record of what happened. So we're using a lot of inferential, essentially, techniques and experimental and mathematical and even philosophical approaches to thinking about this.
Sure.
So then, we think about the evolution of sort of complex life on Earth largely in a major transitions framework. And I saw actually you had a prior guest who talked about Maynard Smith and Zach Murray's book, The Major Transitions in Evolution, which is sort of a foundational text in this regard. And they sort of talk about how life has evolved through a series of steps where it's sort of the two things that they kind of actually makes up two different types of transition. There's the one where literally the biological units that were the organism evolved to become a part of a new kind of organism. And that's what happens for things like multicellular organisms, where a cell was the organism, and then it forms a group of cells, and that group becomes the organism, and the cell evolves into a part. This has occurred at multiple different levels in the history of life on Earth. The evolution of eukaryotic cells, for example, like the cells in our bodies that have a nucleus, and they're very complex cells. Those evolve from a symbiosis between a bacteria and an archaea, and the whole all the cool biology there. It's a fascinating story, right? Like it's sort of a fusion of these two different domains of the sort of tree of life into the third domain, which is eukaryotes. And we see this happening frequently with symbiosis. So this kind of cells sucking up another cell and making them their part of their organism, like that happens all the time. If you've heard of the mitochondria in your cell, the powerhouse of the cell, like it was formerly a free living bacterium, alpha proteobacterium. It's now this integral part of your cell. It could never go free living again, And you see the same thing happening within multicellular organisms. Groups of cells evolve, those groups become specialized. If I scrape cells off my arm and drop them on the floor, they don't scurry off as amoebae and eventually recapitulate a new will somewhere else. Like they're at a dead end, right? And this transition's occurred many times, at least 25 times, is the way we often describe it, but really it's actually far, far more. It's happened at least 25 times just within the green algae alone. It's only happened thousands of times, if not millions of times in the history of life on Earth, and a few of those have just run away with the complexity and the ecological importance of those lineages. So plants and animals and fungi, those are hugely impactful major transitions. 80% of all of the life on Earth, in terms of just the biomass of them, by one estimate, is in plants. And that's one independent origin of multicellularity that occurred only about 450 million years ago, which is geologically speaking pretty recent. Then you even have multicellular organisms that undergo this version of a major transition, like a hive of like a colony of bees. Essentially you can have the group of multicellular organisms evolve to become the organism, and the former individuals become a part. So if I take worker bees, they can't survive on their own. They can't reproduce. Well, actually, they can only make male offspring. But basically they require the sort of whole colony in order for them to survive. And really the sort of evolutionary units being sculpted by Darwinian selection is the group, no longer the individual. So these are these sort of tiered changes where like life essentially forms a new level, and then that becomes the organism, and the adaptations occur at that new level. and former organisms become these integrated parts
Right.
that can no longer survive on their own. That's one kind of major transition. Often we call that an evolutionary transition in individuality, because we're sort of talking about what the level of the biological individual is. The other kind of major transition is one where you have a shift in the way that information is utilized, stored, manipulated. And so that's really, I think, where humans have run away with things, right? So, you know, a non-human example would be like the evolution of sexual reproduction, where, you know, you basically have these two, you know, essentially two organisms mix their genomes entirely to make the next generation, right? And it's not a hierarchical levels thing. It's a different kind of information manipulation, but sexual reproduction was very important in biology. We can talk about that if you want, but it's a very important step.
Yeah.
You know,
how does information play a role there? So I'm trying to understand the connect between information and this, you know, sexual reproduction as a transition form.
Did you say cognition? Sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Sorry. Yeah, maybe the signal dropped here. So you were talking about the second type of transition related to information.
Yeah.
And in that context, you talked about sexual reproduction as a way of forming different life forms.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand the correlation between information and, you know,
yeah,
this transition form.
right. So I'll give you another example. So there's major transitions that were hugely impactful, but didn't require the creation of a new level of life in the way that like two cells coming together to form a new kind of cell is a sort of almost a hierarchy, like those Russian nesting dolls, right? If I look inside my body, I'm composed of these cells, many cells. Okay, cool. If I look inside each cell, those are composed of a fusion of cells, right? And so you can kind of hierarchically unpack some major transitions. There's another kind of major transition, though, that doesn't have a hierarchy, but it's a fundamental shift in how information is used. So the origin of a genetic code is an example of using it, you know, the information that can be stored in a polymer of biomolecules to be a repository of you know, essentially biological data that can be modified and tweaked and amplified over evolutionary time. And that's a big deal. If previously all you have are, you know, selection acting on, say, chemistry themselves, but there's no polymerized mechanism for storing information, you have it's much harder to sort of accumulate complexity and evolve complex structures than once you can take information and encode it. Like that's a huge breakthrough, right? And so life figures that out pretty early. It's not really a hierarchical kind of transition, but it's an information transition.
Literally, yeah.
And so humans have done a lot of things in the sort of information transition space that I think are kind of unique to humans. Some of them aren't, and we just do them really, really well. So, you know, the origin of language, learning, intelligence, and cultural evolution as being a potent factor. Like these are all things which a lot of other organisms do. I'm not sure if language is, I mean, I don't know if we have a great example of like a language that is sort of you know, that utilizes in discrete parts that essentially have combinatorial meaning. Most animal languages are like, you know, if I'm yelling at you, it means this one thing. If I'm, you know, like essentially there's like a one-to-one correspondence between a signal and a response and a meaning. Whereas just like the genetic code, human language is this combinatorial thing where a small number of phonemes or a small number of letters can be combined into this gigantic information space. And you'd have no chance of knowing what these things mean if you don't understand how to decode them. Just like a genetic code is ABGCT doesn't mean anything to you if you don't know how to decode it. You know, a series of sounds means nothing. Whereas if you know, if a dog is barking at you, you know exactly what it means without having to understand dog barking language. So they don't really have combinatorial language. I don't know if any organisms do. Some might, but it might just be a lack of being able to decipher them. Like whales might. But I don't know of any, I don't think we have any good examples of like, yes, animals have evolved languages that are comparable to humans. But once humans evolved this, like it's kind of parallel to the genetic code, right? Once humans have evolved the mechanism of storing and transmitting information, we can begin to accumulate information across generations and across people in a way that's fundamentally transformative, right? We don't have to simply live, you know, if you look at the rate of sort of tools evolution, across
from
different human species.
Stone
Right?
Age to
Yeah, it's exponential. Like it took hundreds of thousands of years for
Stone Age to appear.
changes in very slow changes in the way that we made adzes and spirit points to evolve, right? And you see this, exponentially accelerating rate of tool development, and it continues to the present day, right? What was the time lag between figuring out how to fly a crappy little airplane and shooting a rocket to the moon? 50 years?
50 years,
it's ridiculous. It's insane. And it's
so you brought up two very good ways to think of transitions that lead to evolution, right? So when you talked about the evolutionary transition where the life form changes to another life form, and then the other one you talked about is based on the information collection, dissemination, utilization, and all of that. Are there triggers that trigger these transitions, or why do these transitions happen?
That's a really good question, and partly it's difficult to make generalizations across such different types of event, right? The evolution of a genetic code is so different from the evolution of a eukaryotic cell or human language, right? Like these are very, very different things.
Right.
I think I don't know if triggers are the way I think about it as much as the evolutionary and ecological success afforded to things that gain these traits and adaptations often makes them very successful. And so if you look at it post hoc, if you're looking backwards in history, it looks like these things suddenly appeared and take over. In reality, it's not so fast. It's not like suddenly appear, but it's over geological time it is. But I think it has more to do, with essentially once you can figure out how to build, a multicellular body, and that body can do cool things that no single cell organism can do because they're just not big and have multiple cells. Well, then there's, ecological opportunities that you can have that no one else has, right? Except for other multicellular competitors. And now you get an arms race and innovation. Think about why we have trees. Trees don't get any more light than algae growing on the surface of the soil. They're just getting the same exact sun, right? Why evolve to form a tree that grows 300 feet in the air, right? That's a lot of work. Well, it's because it's the outcome of an arms race. If I can grow above you and take your light, I win, right? So if you have a 450 million year arms race running for things to grow over each other to get the light first, then you get trees. It's totally an arms race. It's a zero sum game. There's only a certain amount of joules in light hitting the surface of the earth.
Right.
That's not totally true.
Some other guests have talked about this concept as a zero-sum game, and it's always, how do you either avoid extinction or adapt to the environment? So, if we look at the history and we look at the last, 3.5 billion years since life formed, or the last 450 million years, or last 100 million years, yes, if you look at us as humans, we can see certain adaptations, right? We have a straighter backbone, etc. Do you see any evidence today where we as humans, as human bodies, are beginning to adapt to transitions that may be, happening that we are not aware of, but our bodies are already adapting to those?
Yeah, I'm no expert in human evolution.
Sure.
So I'll just give you the things that I teach about when I teach intro evolution, right? But partly I'll say that there's really no stopping evolutionary change, right? Like if you have a population of things that are reproducing, and we have genes at various frequencies in that population, those genes are going to change in frequency through time, even if it's not adaptive. So basically, there is no stopping evolution. In a biological population, it's going to happen, whether it's adaptive or not. So humans definitely, you often hear people say, well, because we are no longer dying of, we're not stepping on a rusty nail and dying of an infection, blah, blah, blah. Humans are no longer evolving. And that's not true. We've definitely released some selective pressures that would have, removed specific variants from the population. We've relieved some of that selection, but it hasn't stopped us from evolving. The other thing is, right, remember that the way that sort of adaptive evolution works is that very competing variants of an allele, which is a position on a genome. Each position in the genome has variants that exist in the population. They're effectively in competition with each other. And as they change in frequency in that population, that's how we define evolution from a sort of, quantitative genetics perspective.
I see. Okay.
And so to tie that kind of adaptive evolution to essentially living in like the modern day, you need to sort of end up, there's only really two ways to change the frequency of a version of a gene, which is an allele in a population. That's either add more to it through reproduction or remove them through death. It's birth, death, all of biology is a birth, death process, right? And so I don't know of any good evidence sort of tying, modern living to sort of Darwinian evolution at the level of loci, at the level of gene variants. On the other hand, if we look back to the last 10,000 years, there's some really great examples of Darwinian evolution within human populations. So, one example is lactose expression in adults. Traditionally, we only made the enzyme lactose, which breaks down a sugar in milk, lactose, as infants. And once we were a few years old, our bodies just stopped making it because you're not eating lactose anymore. And a lot of people today are lactose intolerant because they don't eat lactose, and microbes grow on it, and your stomach bloats, and you're unhappy. And yet, in a number of populations throughout the world that essentially evolved from hunter-gatherers into essentially shepherds or cattle or sheep rearing populations, where adults are drinking milk as a major calorie source. You not just only see lactose tolerance and lactose expression in adults evolving, but you can pinpoint the specific variants of these genes that have different regulation that causes them to be expressed even in adults. And you cannot just pinpoint the genes, you can show through really cool population genetic sequencing that they've expanded very recently to large numbers, because essentially all of the regions around them are depopulative diversity. Most populations have a lot of diversity in our different loci, but around the regions flanking these genes that affect lactose expression are depopulative diversity, meaning these sequences just exploded in the population and kind of took over, because individuals that had them could drink milk as adults. And if you're raising cattle, that's really beneficial. So we do see human evolution for sure in recent times. It's much harder to link that kind of population genetic data to anything like sitting on a computer for 12 hours a day, so eating highly refined processed
food,
any of these things,
Yeah, I mean, that is not that long a timeline as it is for
evolution is a thing that occurs over generations, and
we have
very many generations in modern life. And to a certain extent, we can actually buffer against some of the things that would be providing strong selection. So if a modern diet were to cause rampant diabetes at a young age and people died before they could have kids from it or something, I'm just kind of spitballing, but that's an example. Those people that would have been able to have kids may be able to if you can treat it with medication or something, right? So there's one other thing to consider, which is that a lot of our medicine is aimed at extending quality and duration of life. And biologically speaking, that may not have a very big impact on Darwinian processes, in the sense that by the time you've had your own kids, whatever happens to you is a smaller biological consequence. There is this idea that humans and whales are the only two mammals that have ever evolved, as far as I know, I'm pretty sure this is true, that have ever evolved menopause, where females stop being able to have kids. And sort of in most organisms, that wouldn't make sense. You just kind of have kids until you die, right? Why voluntarily stop having kids? And in humans, there's this grandmother hypothesis that essentially, if you have your own kids and your kids have kids, you still have a vested genetic interest in your grandchildren, right? Each of them is 1/4 of you.
1/4 of you, yeah.
Yeah. And so if there's more to be gained by essentially stopping your own reproduction, but aiding the reproduction of your kids and improving the survival of their kids, then essentially you can have selection for reproductive cessation, allowing for better care of grandchildren. And again, it's a hypothesis. It's very difficult to test these kinds of hypotheses for things like humans. It's much easier to test them in lizards or yeast or whatever, right? In humans, it's easy to generate hypotheses, difficult to definitely test them.
Yes.
But it's at least consistent with that explanation.
Yeah, no, I mean, we have already talked about some very, very interesting topics here, including lactose tolerance and then menopause. And you already started to touch on the role of medicine, right? And you talked about synthetic biology as one of your areas of interest when we started this uh, uh, session today. So I think, and it may not be in the most refined state, but I think we have technology today through CRISPR, through other biological techniques where we can actually, impact human trajectory by moving away from medicine being a way to prevent and or cure to eliminate and almost create superhumans, right? Who can survive in any different environment. Why don't we do that? Or should we do that?
I don't know if we could make humans that could survive any different environment. I think trade-offs are kind of a fundamental part of life, right? So
Okay.
we have organisms that can live below freezing. We have organisms that can live above boiling, right?
Mhm.
And yet there's nothing that can live at each of those temperatures just fine, because there's fundamental trade-offs in how you make, the electrostatic point of your proteins, the fluidity of membranes, like, essentially the trade-offs are, I think, the reason that we don't have anything that's good at all environments is because trade-offs require specialization. So you can CRISPR all you want, but I don't think you're going to make humans that can survive a hugely diverse set of environments more than we already have. Okay. We are sort of fundamentally limited by our cell biology, right? Now, that being said, I think technology affords a sort of a power-up suit in a way that genetics doesn't, right? Like,
Right,
so,
right,
so, I think one of the questions was like, are we worried about human extinction?
right.
And I'm in the long run, of course, we're going to go extinct. Everything goes
Right.
extinct in the long run, right? That's the beauty of an infinite timeline,
Right.
absorbing boundaries.
Right.
In the short run, I am really not worried about it, even though I think it's going to be kind of terrible for the planet. Humans are extraordinarily creative and tough. I mean, when I worry about humanity, I think back to the fact that for 10,000 years, you had humans living on pack ice, hunting seals with bone spears.
Mm-hmm.
That is a level of ingenuity and grit and determination and toughness that is far beyond anything modern humans do.
Yeah.
It's insane.
I can survive there today. Yeah.
Yeah, and they do it through innovation, right? They do it through cultural transmission of accumulated knowledge. Because if you took any modern human and threw them up in, the Arctic and said survive, they would all die.
Yeah.
Right? There's no way. So it requires community, it requires cultural knowledge, it requires specialization. But like humans, we're stubbornly resilient. And even if our population gets, 99% gets knocked off by something really, really bad, the little remaining, pockets of humanity, I think, are just going to stick around. And I wouldn't be surprised that if we looked at a 500,000 year timeline, you see episodic flourishes of humanity and then recessions of humanity. That's
very interesting. So, is there evidence of that? Because I recall on one of the shows, one of our guests talked about that. There were many human families that started, but at one point, all of them got extinct, and only one family has created all of the humans that we are on planet Earth. So, do you see evidence of that?
I mean, that type of deep time coalescence is it's kind of one of the ubiquitous features of evolutionary biology. It's not really human specific. Like any single, essentially, that's just like kind of how biology works. That as you go back in time, a bunch of lineages and branches that had spurred off of what was there eventually peter out, and the population gets filled back with the things that weren't there. And so the further you go back in time, the faster you coalesce back to common ancestors of big different branches, right? And so in humanity, I'm not a human population geneticist, but I recall that like the estimated bottleneck size for the populations which left North Africa and colonized the rest of the world 70,000 years ago, give or take, was on the order of like 100, 120 men and half that many women, or something very, very small, like a small group, genetically left Africa and, essentially was the lineage which colonized the rest of the planet. Pretty astonishing. And that's not that long. I mean, 70,000 years is a while, but that's not that long in terms of the broader sweep of things. Right. And you'll have similar types of bottlenecks occurring when, essentially in geographically as you go around the world. So we see much less. We see essentially a reduction in genetic diversity the further you get from Africa, right? So by the time you have populations making their way all the way down to North America, right, across Asia, over the Bering Land Bridge, through Alaska, down through Canada, through North America, down into South America, you see this continued reduction in genetic diversity in indigenous populations, and you see actually a reduction in the diversity of languages, in the sense that the number of phonemes that constitute the language also shrink down. And the explanation for this is that you have essentially a series of spatial bottlenecks. You have small groups moving off over time, and every time you take a subset of a population, you only take a subset of the diversity with you, and that diversity can build back up over time through standard mutation types of processes in biology, but that takes time. And so that process of serial bottlenecking winnows diversity.
But so you talked about, if we look at a longer timeline, there have been times when we have grown and then shrunk and grown and shrunk as human race. Is that what I gathered you say?
I would assume that has to be true. I don't think that continued exponential increase is really feasible. I don't know, and I don't know if we actually know how to get that data, in the sense that it'd be really hard to estimate human population size for the last 200,000 years, and once sort of the last 10,000 years have been very different, right? The last 10,000 years, we've had civilization become a feature,
right?
And that's completely changed the equation, right? The carrying capacity of humans pre-domestication of agricultural species is low.
Yes,
it's tiny, and so it's only in the last 10,000 years that we've domesticated crop plants, and we've domesticated animals, and we've shifted to an agrarian lifestyle. We've had extensive cultural division of labor, where once you have a surplus of resources and you're no longer moving around, then you have farmer castes and soldier castes and priest castes, or maybe not castes, but
those groupings of
careers, jobs. Essentially you have this cultural specialization and division of labor that's only afforded by the fact that you have a large resource base to draw upon, right? If you didn't have surplus food to feed your soldiers, you wouldn't have soldiers, right?
Right. So, I mean, what we can, kind of conclude is that humans are more than their biology. It is their information structures, their culture, language, etc., that really makes them a unique species, and that's what makes them really creative, and that's what makes them really resilient, and they always find ways to survive. So, and we also talked about some of the limitations of biology in terms of making us adapt to any environment, but with creativity, maybe we can. With exoskeletons, maybe we can. So, with that perspective in mind, and going back to the thesis of, this whole idea of race for space happening as well, do you see human creativity driving us to go into space and figuring out ways to adapt there, or do you think we will still stay focused on just evolving on planet Earth? I know it's a very, very broad and question, but let's have it.
I mean, my perspective, I'm a bit of a space pessimist, actually.
Oh, you are?
I am, in the sense that it's so hard. It's so, I mean, like every single thing is working against you, right? It's hard to get off the planet. It's hard to get to the next planet because they're far away. Those planets are not anywhere near habitable, right? So I think it's almost impossible for us to trash planet Earth to the point where space is a better option. I think it's almost impossible. We have all the reasons. We have a breathable atmosphere. We have plenty of liquid water. We have, we have the right gravity. It's, we have to essentially make it unhabitable, and not just through like nuking each other into oblivion, but like worse than that, right?
Yeah,
Because you can always shield yourself. You can live underground, whatever, right? There's ways. Essentially, there's you can solve problems on Earth that any problem we throw at ourselves, I'll say, because I don't think there's anything else that can throw a problem at us like what we can throw at ourselves. Maybe an asteroid.
Right.
That being said, I think we will explore space. I think we will set up probably small outposts, maybe on Mars, that might be permanently inhabited. But for the foreseeable future, for me, I am an evolutionary biologist that studies yeast, so take everything I'm saying with that grain of salt. For the next couple hundred years, it might just be, essentially like the International Space Station, just a small group of people doing cool science and doing essentially, can humans do this type experiments? Can humans live on Mars full time, right? But I don't see it ever. I mean, maybe not. Maybe ever is the wrong word, but the difficulty required to make it an easily self-sustained ecosystem, right? With the kinds of resources that Earth provides us for free: breathable atmosphere, plenty of liquid water, a nice warm temperature, et cetera, right? Like, we don't really have anything that gives us that. So you'd have to make all of those very basic things. And I don't know why we would. Like, if the cost to going to Mars were, in modern terms, over someone's lifetime, if each country could support 100 people for their lifetime, and that took 1% of their budget, like, would you do that? Like, I just don't know why you would. If there's some way that you could essentially make it self-sustaining so that humanity sort of, in the science fiction sense, sort of spreads throughout the universe, right? And so we haven't even talked about getting outside of our solar system, which is dauntingly difficult. The interstellar spaces are huge. And anyway, so I'm a bit of a space pessimist, just because it's just so difficult and expensive. But
so I'm going to throw another question at you here, right? And so I fully agree with you that the barriers or the motivation to really leave Earth probably is not there right now, except for maybe in science fiction and maybe the romantic side of human race, because of things like you described, right? Warm weather, breathable air, oxygen, food, etc., etc. That's all good. All the evidence says we should not be. But from a biologist perspective, from a scientific perspective, do you see any evidence at all over the next 100, 200, 500,000 years where there may be a need, there may be enough disruption to life sustainability on planet Earth as we know it that may trigger an escape? I mean, is there any evidence at all from a biologist perspective where you see the ecosystem really beginning to break down?
I don't think so. I mean, from a need perspective, I think it's essentially, like I said earlier, I think it's essentially impossible for us to trash Earth to the point where we would abandon it. There's no climate change scenario where Earth is worse than Mars. And it's never going to be close.
Yep.
Even if you had like consistent, never-ending super tornadoes ripping up the equatorial 20% of the Earth, the poles are going to be plenty nice. It's going to be great weather in Antarctica.
Yep.
And things like that have happened in Earth's history.
Ice Age happened,
yeah. So that being said, if we do end up exploring space, I doubt it'll be to escape an apocalypse. My guess is that it actually has more to do with the spirit of human creativity and exploration that is sort of more of a Star Trek, the Next Generation style view of things, right? It's like, humans are extraordinarily creative. We are extraordinarily adventurous. The fact that humans colonized Hawaii in tiny wooden canoes without any kind of modern navigation stuff, right?
Right.
That's probably equally risky or less risky than shooting off in a rocket, right?
Exactly.
And humanity did that repeatedly. They colonized a ton of islands out throughout the Pacific, right? Humans are, Ernest Shackleton did some insane things.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you read the story, just bring around the Cape and on. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. So humans are willing to just put themselves into the direst of straits in the name of exploration. So I think that if we do end up, if we're able to like create some, and it might be that planetary settlement is not as feasible as just making a really big spaceship that's capable of creating enough resources and recycling things efficiently enough that, with a big old nuclear power reactor on board, so you have infinite energy and you can grow food and recycle all of your atoms, right? That you could have a multi-generational exploration spacecraft in 500 years or something. I think that's totally feasible, and that's that takes 500 years to get to the next solar system that we want to explore, and during that time you have a bunch of generations. Are they going to make it? Are they not? Who knows, right? But humans might do that. I wouldn't put it past us, but I doubt it would be escaping apocalypse as much as creativity-led exploration.
Very interesting. Very interesting, because what I will say is, now we have heard two views from two different biologists on this. The view today is space pessimism. The view we have heard from a space biologist is that the Earth already has reached a resource limit, and it is a fight for extinction, to escape extinction, and for that we may actually explore space. And then I see, and that's the beauty of this.
I'll just comment on that, which is that we're approaching our resource limit, but our carrying capacity is ridiculously high. We could sustainably keep 7-8 billion humans around on planet Earth, right? And that's a ridiculously large number. And if we drop down to 7 million, right, 1,000-fold reduction, that's still a ton of humans, like relative to what you're going to pack onto a spacecraft or get onto Mars living in a bubble. You're just not going to get that many humans living on Mars without just like terraforming. That requires, I don't know, I'm not an expert on terraforming, but I think the cost of planetary terraforming would be insane. It's like,
right now it is unimaginable
resources, right? Yeah. I mean, Earth is really, really, really good for humans, right? And even if we were all living in underground bunkers and eating algae that we grow by, photovoltaic infused light, because nothing can touch the surface because it's such a radioactive hellscape. And filtering all of our air before we breathe it, right, through some sort of radioactive mops, like that's still probably a lot easier than anything that we'll ever do in space. I don't see how we could trash Earth enough that it would be a worse option than trying to live on a bubble on Mars or living in a spaceship for multiple generations, where you talk about biological problems. You're going to have severe problems of inbreeding depression. You'll have to really manage against that. You can't just have the same group of 100 people mating with each other for multiple generations. You start to get severe birth defects, so you'd have to sperm bank humanity's genetic DNA and send it off into your little seed vessel and hope everything goes okay. And if it doesn't, humans are extinct, something like that.
Yeah, then I mean, for that to happen, we absolutely have to have an apocalypse. And that's why I asked you the question from a scientific perspective. Do you see any evidence of us facing that sometime in the near future? I mean, you hear about a meteor hitting planet Earth, and you hear about, climate crisis, etc. But you're right. I mean, yes, some of that is happening, but the rate of change is not that rapid that we may need to react to an apocalyptic scenario. At least not that we can foresee. If it happens, that can happen.
I will say one other thing is that maybe CRISPR could be used on the human seed ship, in the sense that you could basically sequence every artificially inseminated embryo, see if there's any known genetic defects. If there are, fix them with CRISPR, and away you go. You don't need a
you don't grow them.
You just need synthetic biology.
Yeah. And that's the big ethical question today as well, right? You can take gene edit to avoid that, but then should you? Yeah. So Anthony Tillman, anything from your end for Dr. Ratcliff?
Yeah, Dr. Ratcliff, first and foremost, thank you very much for taking the time to make an appearance on the show. I think I can speak for everyone when we say we definitely got a new perspective today on space travel and our evolutionary history, so to speak. And what's next. But one of the things that I kind of wanted to challenge you on, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
was your idea of, okay, so if we're not going to go to space, we're going to stay on Earth. Do you eventually foresee a future in which humans slowly adapt, maybe with the Earth's climate change, to live the way we live now, or will we either be in space or in kind of underground bunkers, so to speak? So maybe to clear that up a little bit, do you see humans kind of adapting over generations with the Earth's changes, or do you foresee us just either living in bunkers or on Mars?
Oh, I think we'll adapt. But I think it'll be more technological than biological.
Okay.
In the same way that, prior to any modern technology, you had humans, evolved in the tropics, right? Uh, Equatorial Africa is the origin of humanity, give or take. And so, from there we colonized environments as different as, the Arctic, which without, there's a little bit of genetic adaptation involved there, or the tops of really high altitude mountains, right? There's some genetic adaptation, but it's not a huge amount relative to cultural innovations which allow humans to live there, right? In fact, it's probably better that we evolved in the tropics. I mean, better for humanity, and we could then go out to colder and colder, areas of the planet because you can put clothes on. If you evolved in the Arctic and tried to go to a warmer place, you'd be fighting biology. How do you get cooler? That's much harder than staying warm. Right. So, but yeah, I mean, I think climate change is going to create massive upheavals for societies which have been built around a world working the way it is right now. But I wouldn't conflate that with it making the planet uninhabitable, right? You're going to have, areas of the planet that are currently habitable that won't be because they'll be so hot. At least, they'll be so hot, right? But you'll have areas in the north that are going to be really, really nice, right? And so, it's going to be great for northern Russia. It's going to be great for Canada. Like in terms of like climate, I don't think it's going to make it any harder to live in those types of environments. So there's a lot of land up there. It's not like all of the land is like stuck right on the equator. We actually do have a lot of land in the north, not so much in the south, but a lot of land in the north. And that being said, I think there will be very strong incentives to figure out technological solutions to allowing people to live in areas that right now with modern ways of living wouldn't be habitable, right?
Right.
So I guess I'm sort of, I'm an optimist for humans. I think we will figure it out at the expense of other things, right? We'll figure it out to make ourselves comfortable at the expense of many other living things. And in some sense, the thing that is the most depressing is not really, to me, its effect on humanity, because I think there will be a lot of people that get the short end of the stick, and that's something we should really be seriously addressing, right? The rich will always be fine. The poor are going to really suffer. But we're going to have mass extinctions that just continue apace or maybe even accelerate. And that's really deeply unsettling to me, because we're changing the course of life on Earth at a rate that we can't really comprehend, because from our perspective, we're like the Matrix, right? Like biological time, evolutionary and ecological time is slow. 100,000 years is not very long, right? And our lives only last 100 years. And so it's totally like the Matrix. Like we're creating all this change, but we don't see it. But if you were to even go back 2 or 3 generations and say, hey, great grandpa, does this look like the way you remembered it? They'd be like shocked, like, wow, it's so different, right? Like, and so I think we basically continue to reset our barometers from our childhood of what normal is. And over our lifespan, we're like, oh, wow. Like you probably, I'm from California. I'm from Berkeley, California. I live in Atlanta now. But since I left Berkeley 20 years ago, the climate has changed so much that we have wildfires and drought every year, basically, that were really uncommon, relatively uncommon when I lived there 20 years ago. So even in my very short lifetime, I've only lived 40 years, I've seen massive changes. And a lot of these things are slow moving. It's a giant barge that even if you stop putting on the gas, it's just going to keep happening. Huge human population sizes, again, well, maybe good for humanity's persistence, just exacerbate the strain on almost every other organism. And so I'm sort of an optimist for humans, and I'm sort of a pessimist for everything else.
Yeah.
So
No, I
the only
think that was
thing I
very
wanted
well
to, oh, sorry, you got it.
Go ahead, Owen.
Oh, I think he was just going to thank you. And I will also thank you. Thank you again for coming on. So the one thing I wanted to bring up was we talked with Dr. Jordan Oki last episode, and we started to touch on it, and I would like to see if we can get a little bit more out of you. There are some technological advances that we're making that I feel like are having an actual effect on our biology. And in the instance that I'll bring up is the estrogenic effect of plastics. What we've seen with the hormonal profile of young men in particular over the past even 40 years, what is now the normal reference range for testosterone, about 200 to 700 nanograms per deciliter. Even 50 years ago, 700 was the average. So what is now our high end of the reference range for the average person was middle of the road before, and then presumably even before that, potentially even low. So I guess I wanted to ask, what do you see in terms of basically crafting our own evolution, be it even accidentally? We're accidentally applying, outside factors that are affecting the way our children develop. Obviously, the hormonal profile of pregnant women affects the hormonal profile of the children that they give birth to. So the things that we're doing are actually, it's not just the child's born with a normal testosterone level and it's decreased by the surrounding. It's genetic, now it's biological. So I was wondering if you could speak on that a little bit.
That's a great point. I mean, I think you said it really well. We're not separate from our environments, right? And we are absolutely developmentally molded into the environment that we're creating, right? In a sense, we are sort of what we do repeatedly. And so I think this is important both for how our diets and our environments affect our cell biology, but also I'm really curious to see how like the sort of smartphone revolution of how we spend our time is going to change things, right? Because all of a sudden we're all on screens for 12 hours a day. My kids who are really young use screens a ton. And part of it's because, hey, we're in a pandemic and I got to work. Go ahead and watch TV, right? Like I got to get stuff done, right? And, actually my power went out and my cell phone at the same exact time, my power went out and my cell phone carrier went down for a day. So I had like zero internet and it was really weird. I woke up in the morning and I was just like fidgeting, like, what do I do? Like, I bet you there's also important emails that I have to get to and I can't, should I call? Oh, that's right, I can't call, I have no cell phone. It was really, and so I felt like my umbilical cord to the world was just severed. And I was like, how do I interact with the world now, So I guess I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but like, I think that the point that you're raising, which is that compared to a generation ago, we live in a new world and that world is changing our bodies. It's also changing our minds. And I don't know how that's going to manifest. I guess that kind of goes both ways though, that if you, to put this in the context of space exploration, if you want someone to be able to survive on a spaceship for 60 years and not go insane and kill every other person and themselves on that ship, like you probably can't just take a modern human and stick him in there and be like, hey, figure it out. Like, probably won't work. So then maybe you might actually have to take the same approach of, I don't know, raising humans in completely foreign conditions to prepare them for, by the time they're an adult, to jump on a spaceship and be enclosed in four walls 24/7 for 50 years, right? Because I truly don't think you could just take people now that have been running around outside and having that world, just stick them in a aluminum box for the rest of their life. Like, how does that work? Psychologically, how does that work? Not even technologically. So humans are extraordinarily plastic. That's the other thing, right? We can go from being pretty content, scratching in the soil and planting our seeds and sitting by the campfire and telling stories with our relatives and friends, and we can be pretty content sitting on our computers and talking to other faces that are an abstract representation of humanity. I think our flexibility is our real strength. It's and maybe it's something which we would have to explicitly consider if we were trying to dramatically change the way that we live and not have it break down, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Tillman, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm yeah. I did. I think it's just such an interesting conversation because I think a lot of times we do separate ourselves a little bit from our environment or think that we're, a separate entity, but we really are subject to a lot of the things. And so, yeah. And you bring up a good point too, with if you want to have a human that can spend their whole life in a tin can, don't you have to kind of raise that kind of a human? And then we get right back. And this is where we keep circling back to is ethics. How do you justify raising a child in a tin can for the sole purpose of living its life in a tin can? Like that's its own person, so I don't know. It is interesting. And thank you very much for your response. It's one of many very important things you said today.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful. No, very good discussion. I mean, just the whole topic of transitions and how life forms and then the role of information in human evolution, all the way to your space pessimism and human optimism. I think, these are certainly a lot of food for thought for us, for our students, and, for humanity at large. Yeah, I'm never the guy who says, no, it can't happen or it won't happen. But it's also great to hear that at least from your perspective, from a biologist perspective, from a scientist perspective, we don't see the forming of an apocalypse anytime in the near future. If it happens, it happens, but you don't see any evidence. Even with the climate change.
I foresee, major upheaval and challenges, but that's very different from an apocalypse that makes Earth uninhabitable.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's end on that positive note today, that there is no apocalypse coming anytime soon. Thank you again so much for your time, and truly a pleasure. And we will be in touch shortly with the recording and follow up.
Sounds great. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Thanks for inviting me on. And
all right.
Project.
Yeah, thank you so much. You take care.
Cool. Okay, take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.